All right, come closer, sit down. I want to tell you something, and I need you to pay attention because this one right here, it is not like the ones you have heard before. Picture this. It is 1931, Chicago, Illinois, one of the biggest, loudest, most alive cities in the entire United States of America. And on this particular morning, the most feared man in that city, maybe the most feared man in the whole country, is walking into a courtroom. Now, when you hear most feared man in the country, what do you picture? You probably picture someone dangerous looking, someone with cold eyes and scarred hands, someone who walks in and makes the whole room go quiet just by existing. And yes, that description fits this man. But here is what does not fit the picture in your head. He is not walking into that courtroom in handcuffs. He is walking in wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes are shined. His hair is combed. He has lawyers on both sides of him and the best legal team that money, and this man had an enormous amount of money, could buy. His name is Alphonse Gabriel Capone. And the charge that brought him to this courtroom on this day. Not murder. Not the dozens of men who died because he ordered it. Not the gambling operations that ran day and night across the city. Not the bootleg liquor that flowed through Chicago like water through a river during the entire decade that alcohol was illegal in America. No, the charge is tax evasion. Taxes. He never paid his taxes. Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, that is it, taxes. That is how the most powerful criminal in America got caught. Yes. And by the time I finish this story, you are going to understand exactly why. And you are going to understand something else too. Something that goes beyond Al Capone and Chicago in 1931. You are going to understand what happens to every single person who spends their whole life believing the rules were written for everybody else but them. So, let us go back to the beginning. Brooklyn, New York, 1899. A baby boy is born to a family of Italian immigrants. His father cuts hair for a living. His mother sews clothes. They are not rich. They are not poor. They are the kind of family that wakes up early, works all day, comes home tired, and does it again the next morning. Honest people, hardworking people. They name the boy Alphonse. Al for short. Now here is the thing about young Al Capone that you need to understand. He was not born bad. Nobody is born bad. What he was born with was a brain that worked fast, a personality that pulled people toward him, and a temper that he had not yet learned to control. He was smart. His teachers said so. He could have done something with that intelligence. In a different life, in different circumstances, with different people around him at the right moments, Al Capone might have become a businessman, a lawyer, a politician. But here is what actually happened. He is 14 years old, sitting in school, and a teacher hits him. We do not know exactly what for. Something small probably. Something that in another moment might have passed without incident. But Al hit her back. And that was the end of school. Now, I want you to stop here with me for a second, because this moment, this small, almost forgettable moment, a 14-year-old boy losing his temper in a classroom, this is not where Al Capone becomes a criminal. Do not make that mistake. Plenty of kids lose their tempers. Plenty of kids get kicked out of school and still go on to live decent lives. What matters is not what Al did in that classroom. What matters is who was waiting for him outside of it. His name was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was a neighborhood crime boss in Brooklyn. He ran rackets, illegal gambling, small operations at first, and he had a talent that every dangerous man in history has shared. He could look at a young person and immediately see what they were made of. He looked at young Al Capone and he saw a boy who was smart, who was angry, who had no patience for the rules other people had laid out, and who had not yet found any direction for all of that energy. Torrio gave him a direction. And this right here, is the moment that actually matters. Because every single one of us, at some point in our young lives, meets someone who offers us a direction. And the direction we choose in that moment, that shapes everything that comes after. Al chose Torrio's direction. He started running small errands for him, then bigger ones. He learned the business from the ground up. He worked in bars and back rooms. He absorbed everything. How the money moved, how people were managed, how loyalty worked and how fear worked, and how the two things together created something almost impossible to fight against. And then Prohibition arrived. January of 1920. The United States government made alcohol illegal across the entire country. Every drop of beer, every bottle of whiskey, every glass of wine. Illegal. Gone. Now, you tell me, what do you think happened when the government told millions of American adults that they could no longer have a drink? They still wanted a drink. Of course they did. And somebody was going to supply that drink. Al Capone, by this point working alongside Johnny Torrio in Chicago, looked at Prohibition and saw the biggest business opportunity in the history of the United States. The government had just made it illegal to sell something that millions of people desperately wanted. All he had to do was be the one selling it. He was 21 years old, and he was just getting started. All right, now we get into the heart of it. By 1925, when Al Capone was 26 years old, he was not running a gang. I need you to understand that. When people say gang, you probably picture something small, something street level, something rough around the edges. What Al Capone built was nothing like that. What Al Capone built was a corporation. Think about the biggest business you can imagine. The kind with multiple departments, hundreds of employees, delivery trucks, accounting teams, and locations spread across an entire city. Now imagine that business is completely illegal and enforced not by lawsuits, but by men with guns. That is what he built. He had breweries producing bootleg beer. He had distilleries producing bootleg liquor. He had trucks to move the product from the breweries to the hundreds of speakeasies. Those were the illegal bars that popped up all over Chicago that depended on him for their supply. He had men protecting the trucks. He had men protecting the men protecting the trucks. And here is the part that made it all work. He had the city. Not figuratively, literally. Politicians on his payroll. Police officers who looked the other way when his trucks rolled through. Judges who made problems disappear. The mayor of Chicago himself, during much of this period, was either connected to Capone's operation or too afraid to seriously challenge it. At the height of his power, Al Capone was bringing in an estimated $60 million a year. Now let me put that in language you can feel. In today's money, that is close to $1 billion every year, coming into the hands of one man who started out as a barber's son from Brooklyn who never finished the 8th grade. He moved into the Metropole Hotel in downtown Chicago and occupied an entire floor, not a room, a floor. He had somewhere between 600 and 1,000 people working for him directly. He threw parties. He wore the finest clothes. He went to the opera. He sat ringside at boxing matches. And here is what nobody tells you about Al Capone. Everybody liked him. I am serious. The man was charming. Genuinely, warmly, surprisingly charming. He remembered names. He asked about your family. He laughed at your jokes. He made you feel like the most important person in the room when he was talking to you. And during the Great Depression, when people all over Chicago were losing their jobs and their homes and standing in lines hopping for a bowl of soup, Al Capone opened soup kitchens. Real ones that fed thousands of real people every single day. He paid for it out of his own pocket. He wanted people to know he paid for it. He showed up at charity events. He gave money to churches. He gave money to schools. Now, I am going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Does that sound like a monster to you? No, it sounds like someone you might like, someone you might even admire. And that is exactly the point. That is exactly why he was so difficult to stop, because the people of Chicago did not see a monster. They saw a man who took care of them when the government did not. But here is the other side of Al Capone, the side that his charm made easy to forget. When people betrayed him, when rivals tried to take what he had built, when someone stepped out of line in a way he decided was unacceptable, the response was not a lawsuit. The response was not a strongly worded conversation. In 1929, at a dinner he hosted, Al Capone personally beat two men to death with a baseball bat. Men he had invited, men he had fed, men who sat at his table and ate his food before he stood up and killed them because he believed they had been disloyal. I am not telling you that to shock you. I am telling you that because it matters for the story. The charm and the violence were not two different people. They were the same man making two different calculations depending on what the situation required. The charm said, "I am worth more to you as a friend than as an enemy." The violence said, "You need to understand what crossing me actually costs." And together, those two things made him almost completely untouchable. Think about it. Who is going to testify against a man like that? Who is going to raise their hand in a courtroom and say, "Yes, I saw Al Capone order that murder," when they know exactly what happens to people who raise their hand against Al Capone? Nobody. For almost a decade, nobody. February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day. 7 men walk into a garage on the north side of Chicago. They are members of a rival gang, the Bugs Morin outfit. They believe they are there to pick up a shipment of stolen whiskey. What is actually waiting for them inside that garage is a group of men dressed as police officers. They line the 7 men up against the wall, and they shoot them. All 7 right there in that garage on Valentine's Day. Now, the country had been watching Chicago's gang wars for years by this point. Violence was not new. Capone's name had been in the newspapers constantly. Everybody knew what was happening. But this was different. This was so organized, so theatrical, so completely without shame, that it landed differently than anything that had come before it. The story went national, then international, and it landed on the desk of the President of the United States. Herbert Hoover looked at what was happening in Chicago and decided that enough was enough. He called in the head of the Treasury Department and he said, in plain terms, "I want Capone. Get him. I do not care how." And this is where the story takes a turn that Al Capone never saw coming. Because up to this point, every attempt to bring him down had focused on the obvious things: the violence, the bootlegging, the corruption, and every time the wall held, no witnesses, no evidence, no problem. But somebody in the federal government had a different idea. The idea was simple, almost embarrassingly simple. Al Capone had never paid taxes. In the United States, it does not matter how you earn your money, legal or illegal. You still owe the government a percentage of it. And if you do not pay, that is a federal crime. And unlike proving that someone ordered a murder, proving that someone had income and did not report it is just math. You just need the numbers. Now here is what Al Capone had not thought about. Because here is the thing about a man who has been getting away with everything for so long. He starts to believe that getting away with things is simply his natural condition, that he is smarter than the system, that certain threats simply do not apply to him. He had thought about police, he had bought them. He had thought about prosecutors, he had bought them. He had thought about witnesses, he had eliminated them or terrified them into silence. He had never thought about a quiet man named Frank Wilson, sitting in a back room at the IRS, going through years and years of financial records looking for one thing: proof of income. And Frank Wilson was patient. He was methodical. He did not care about being famous. He did not care about credit. He just sat in that room day after day going through the numbers. This is the part of the story where I need you to really pay attention. Because this is the part that applies to your life. Not the bootlegging, not the soup kitchens, not the baseball bat. This part. The part where a man who had everything, who had built something genuinely impressive by any measure, who had outmaneuvered every enemy that came at him directly, got undone by the one thing he never bothered to guard against. Because he was sure it did not matter. He was sure. And that certainty, that total, absolute, unshakable certainty that he was above the whole thing, that was the crack. That was where the light got in. Frank Wilson eventually found a former bookkeeper for Capone's gambling operations, a quiet man named Leslie Adelbert Shumway who had kept records, very careful records, numbers written down in ledgers that tracked money flowing through Capone's operation and traceable back to him as income. Shumway was found in Florida. He was frightened. Of course he was frightened. But he was also tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being a small, scared man on the edges of something enormous and violent. He agreed to testify. Then a cashier named Fred Rise, who had also handled Capone's money, was found in South America. He also agreed to talk. One by one, the numbers came together. The walls that had held for a decade started to shake. All right, here is where it gets good. And I mean that, this part of the story, this is the part where you sit up a little straighter. It is 1931. Al Capone has been indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. His lawyers have looked at the situation and they believe they have a path through it. Not a comfortable path, but a path. And Capone has done something that he has done before in legal situations that looked dangerous. He has reached into the jury pool. Members of the jury that has been selected to hear his case have been quietly approached. Some have been bribed. Some have been warned. Either way, Capone believes he knows how those jurors are going to vote when it matters. He has done this before. He knows how it works. He is not worried. He walks into that courtroom on the first day of trial, feeling like a man who already knows the ending. And then the judge does something. Judge James Wilkerson looks out at his courtroom, and without any drama, without any announcement, without giving Capone or his lawyers a single moment to react, he simply swaps his jury with the jury from a completely different courtroom in the same building. Done. Just like that, new jury, clean jury, 12 people who have not been touched. Capone stares at those 12 strangers filing into the jury box, and he understands, maybe for the first time in his adult life, that this time the machinery he has always relied on is not going to save him. The trial lasts 11 days. The government presents the financial records, the ledgers, the testimony from Shumway and Rise, the cash flows that prove income, the complete absence of any tax return filed by the most financially active criminal in American history. The defense does what it can. But what can you say when the numbers are right there on paper, and the man never once, not in the entire decade that he was earning millions of dollars every year, sat down and filed a return? On October 17, 1931, the jury comes back. Guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence, 11 years in federal prison, $50,000 in fines, back taxes plus interest, appeal denied. Now, here is something I want you to picture. The man who ran Chicago, the man who had the mayor and the police chief and the judges and the prosecutors, the man who had fed thousands of people through the Depression and terrified thousands of others into silence, the man who had survived assassination attempts, rival gangs, federal raids, and the full attention of the United States government for years and years. That man is now going to prison for not filing his taxes. He ends up on Alcatraz. That famous rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The prison that is surrounded on all sides by water cold enough and rough enough that even the strongest swimmer would not make it to shore. And here is the part that nobody puts in the movies. While he is in that cell, the syphilis that he had carried in his body for years, that he had never treated because men like him did not worry about things like that, starts to take his mind apart. Guards report that he becomes confused, disoriented, sometimes frightened. The man who never showed fear to anyone is now afraid, alone, in a cell on a rock in the middle of the bay. He gets out in 1939, sentence reduced for good behavior, but he is not the same man. He goes to his mansion in Florida. He sits by the water. He fishes. He is 40 years old and his mind is going. He dies on January 25, 1947. He is 48 years old. Now, I told you at the beginning of this story that it was not just about Al Capone in Chicago in 1931. And I meant that. So let me tell you what this story is actually about. It is about certainty. Not the gangster kind, the everyday kind. The kind that lives inside ordinary people who are not running bootleg liquor operations or bribing politicians, but who still, in their own smaller ways, have decided that certain rules do not apply to them. You know these people, you have met them. The person at work who has been cutting corners for years, and everybody sees it and nobody stops it, and they start to believe that cutting corners is just how they operate and nobody is ever going to say anything. The person in a family who has been getting away with a lie so long that they have started to believe their own version of events. The student who copies someone else's work once and nothing happens, and then does it again and nothing happens, and then begins to believe that it is actually a skill, getting away with it, rather than a debt that is building up quietly in the background. What Al Capone teaches us is not that crime does not pay. That is too simple. Crime paid Al Capone very well for a very long time. What he teaches us is something more specific. He teaches us that certainty is a blind spot. The moment you are completely sure that a particular threat does not apply to you is the exact moment you stop watching for it. And the moment you stop watching for it is when it walks right in through the door you left open. For Al Capone, the open door was a tax return he never filed. Something so basic, so unglamorous, so completely beneath the attention of a man who had survived everything else that had ever come at him. And that is what got him. Not a rival, not a hero, not some brilliant federal masterstroke. A bookkeeper with a ledger and the patience to sit in a room and go through the numbers. Every person in this story made choices. The politicians who took his money made choices. The officers who looked away made choices. The witnesses who stayed quiet made choices. And Al Capone made choices every single day for over a decade. He chose to believe the rules were for other people. He chose to never file a return. He chose to fix a jury without considering that the judge might also know how to play the board. None of those choices were inevitable. At any point, he could have chosen differently. And the thing about choices is that each one makes the next one feel more natural. You cut one corner and nothing happens, and the next corner is a little easier to cut. You break one rule and survive, and the next rule feels a little less solid. Until eventually, you are not really aware of the rules at all. They have just become something other people deal with. That drift, that slow drift away from accountability, that is not something that only happens to gangsters. That happens in offices. That happens in families. That happens in schools and churches and small businesses and neighborhoods all over this country every single day. Al Capone's story is so big and so dramatic that it is easy to look at it and think, that could never be me. I would never end up there. And you are probably right. Most people do not end up there. But most people have met someone who is drifting in that direction. Someone who is a little too certain, a little too comfortable, a little too sure that the rules written on the wall do not apply to the way they actually operate. Pay attention to those people. Not because they are going to build a criminal empire. Most of them will not. But because the ending to their story, whatever shape that ending takes, is almost always the same. Some quiet person in a back room, going through the numbers. And one open door they forgot to lock. That is how Al Capone's story ends. The question is, the next time you see someone operating like they are above it all, like the rules are somebody else's problem, are you going to recognize what you are looking at? Because now you know what it looks like. And you know how it ends.